Hello, I'm Julian and I'd like to welcome you to the second programme of Jeremy and Julian on Wednesdays, a midweek online magazine for everyone in the St Catug ministry area. Thank you for your encouraging response to the first instalment of our programme. You've given us plenty of ideas on how we can develop the weekly menu, and we'll try to keep away from the busy Gilwern traffic in future programmes. Today we're going to begin with some proposals for setting up a Christian book club, followed by a review of a short book by John Lennox that Alison and I have read recently. To complete our programme, Jeremy will talk to us on the subject of entering into God's rest.
Hello, I'm Alison, and I've just been talking to Julian about an idea to launch a Christian book club in the ministry area. There's a wide range of good Christian literature available, but we lead busy lives, and sometimes it seems there's too little time in which to read.
Also, whilst it's good to read on our own, we may feel that there are lessons to share with other members of our church or the ministry area and fellowship. So this proposal for a Christian book club seeks to address these issues and would provide a way of collaborating with Bookish in setting up a church bookstall based in St Edmunds.
So what are we proposing to do?
Well, first of all, we'll invite all those interested to join the book club.
So the books would be selected by members of the group in rotation, and that would ensure a variety of reading, different themes, different theologies.
And we'd hope that regular meetings would be held to discuss and review the selected book and choose new books.
We could hold that meeting by Zoom, now that we're getting used to using Zoom, or in homes, or in a local cafe, and we could have food and drink to go with the reading.
That would provide a regular short input to services, and we could put articles in the ministry area magazine, on Facebook and online. We should be happy to make arrangements for the club if there's sufficient interest. So please let us know your views and ideas. It will only happen if there's sufficient support.
A friend recently recommended and sent us this book, Where is God in a Coronavirus Pandemic? It's very topical, and it was written and published in a very short time as the world as we know it began to change. The author is John Lennox, a mathematics professor at Oxford University, and the publisher is the Good Book Company. It's a short book. Did you find that it was helpful in the circumstances?
Yes, sometimes it's quite good to have a short book that you can read in a matter of hours. And John Lennox identifies well with the feelings of vulnerability that many of us are currently experiencing. And he reminds us of other pandemics in the past. This isn't a unique occurrence. And he asks the question, is God there?
He talks about two different kinds of disasters in the world. Could you expand on that, please?
Yes, he defines natural and moral evil. Natural, where man is not responsible, for example, in earthquakes, and moral, where man is responsible. And he goes on to give two examples, two cathedrals in fact, Christchurch in New Zealand, where an earthquake was a natural disaster and the part of the cathedral collapsed, and Dresden, which was also destroyed, was a moral disaster caused directly by man's action in warfare.
So does John Lennox think that God sent the pandemic? Or does he think it's a punishment for our wrongdoing?
No, he sees it as a natural evil. He contends that there's evidence in the Bible that this type of event is not a direct consequence of sin.
And does he see that the coronavirus can be reconciled with a God of love?
He reminds us that most viruses are supportive of life, and that only about 1% are harmful to people. God's overwhelming character is love, evidenced by the death of his Son.
Towards the end of the book, he asks the question, what should be our response?
Well, first of all, he encourages us to heed the advice of the government and medical experts. This doesn't represent unbelief, rather that God expects us to use existing resources wisely. The second thing he says is that we should maintain a balanced perspective, focusing on the good things of life and not letting anxiety take hold of us. Thirdly, he calls us to love others, sacrificially, just as Christians were recorded as responding to pandemics in earlier centuries. And then finally, he reminds us to remember eternity. Generations of Christians have lived in a dangerous world where life expectancy was low. They had their sights set on a glorious new life beyond the grave, and so can we.
So does he come up with answers for the pandemic?
Well, at the end, John Lennox admits that he hasn't found all the answers. In the meantime, he quotes a great 19th century preacher, Charles Haddon Spurgeon. God is too good to be unkind, and he is too wise to be mistaken. And when we cannot trace his hand, we must trust his heart.
Thank you, Julian. I hope that we've encouraged you to pick up this book and read it for yourselves. Thank you.
And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. That's the end of the first creation account in Genesis. In that account, the name of God in the Hebrew Scriptures is Elohim. Elohim alone is very close in meaning to our word God. And God can be quite a vague sort of word, sometimes used as a proper name, meaning someone in particular, but it can also be used in a fairly general way, in a fairly abstract sort of way. And in the same way, Elohim is sometimes used in the Hebrew Scriptures. So in this account of creation, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It's making an assertion that equally applies to all things in the universe. It is not making a claim about a relationship or a claim about a plan or a promise. It's simply recording a fact that God made the heavens and the earth. And in the same way as recording that fact, that there was nothing made that he did not make, he also says he rested. And on the seventh day he rested. It doesn't actually say that God ever stopped resting, because he is talking about the work of creation. And the work of creation, so far as we can tell, hasn't actually done anything new since we were made. And therefore, according to the Genesis account, God is still resting. Today is still the Sabbath day of the Lord's rest. Now, when Jesus was working, or you might say when Jesus was going about his business, when he was going about his Father's business, he said, "My Father is working, and therefore I am working." And that was his justification for healing on the Sabbath. His Father was working, therefore he is working. But his Father is also resting, because on the seventh day God rested. And therefore Jesus said, "Is it better to save life or to destroy it?" Therefore he heals on the Sabbath. But this principle of rest, according to the Genesis account, is built into the fabric of creation. It is part of the universe, part of the nature of things, part of the nature of all things, irrespective of what they are, or irrespective of who they believe in. The Israelites, as part of the covenant with Moses, were instructed, "You shall observe the Sabbath. You shall keep it holy. part of this was that they were commanded to honour God, and that to keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath, was to honour God. In other words, to not observe the Sabbath was to dishonour God. They required rest simply because they were part of the universe. But to not observe the Sabbath was somehow dishonouring to the covenant which God made with them. Somehow it was contrary to the universe itself to not observe the rest. And they were commanded to do it not just for their own sakes, but it said because you were slaves in Egypt. The Lord said to them, remember, you were once slaves in Egypt, and therefore when you rest, everyone rests. Your maidservants, your manservants, your beasts, your animals, your cattle, the stranger within your gates, everyone rests. Because it said, you were once slaves in Egypt. To sum it up, one might say, the Lord says, you in your nature need to rest because you're part of the universe. I have made this covenant with you, and therefore, to acknowledge and honour this covenant, you shall rest. And furthermore, because you need rest, and because rest is honouring to me, I require you to command all the helpless, all the weak, all those who are defenceless, who are under your power, that they also will rest with you. There are no exceptions. That, though, was part of the covenant of Moses. And the name of the Lord in that account is the Lord, their God. The extra part, the Lord, is the name of God in the covenant. Now, part of this covenant was not just about the Israelites observing a Sabbath rest. It was also about the Israelites observing festivals and feasts. And if you read through the descriptions of the feasts, of Passover, of the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Shelters or Tabernacles or Booths or whatever you call it, you'll see that at the beginning and the end of each feast, of each festival, is a Sabbath rest, an extra day of rest. The actual festival was a time of rejoicing, of partying, of visiting family and friends and having fun, of letting the hair down, of going out dancing, of sharing food, having a happy time, whatever worthy thing pushes your button. But the first and last days were formally declared as Sabbaths, as well as whatever Sabbath fell within that period of 7 or 8 days. And on top of those Sabbaths, there was also Rosh Hashanah, the New Year. And there was also the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And they were also Sabbaths. And so all these times to honour God, to fulfill the covenant, to acknowledge their basic nature as part of the universe, to have compassion on the weak and defenceless, in all these things was acknowledge these rests. Not just days of cessation from work, but also periods of festivity, of celebration, of joy. You might say there was the personal rest, the family rest, and there was the social rest, the rest of the community at the festivals. And added to all these things, there was the prescription that every 7 years the Israelites were not to sow their fields. Now theirs was basically an agricultural economy in which agriculture was the prime economic activity of the people. And therefore the command to rest on the Sabbath year was a command to cease from normal economic activity. It was not planned though as famine or starvation. The Lord promised them that if they observed this, then the harvests before and after the Sabbath year would make up for the fact they were not engaged in their normal agriculture. And so, alongside that rest, there was a promise. By observing this, says the Lord, you will not grow hungry. You'll be okay. But somehow, this Sabbath year, this entire year of diminished activity, was not just for the Israelites, but also for the land. And this whole principle that the land requires rest is the basic way to understand the ethics of the environment in the Bible, the land requires rest, as all things require rest, because it's in the nature of them, in the nature of the universe, to rest. And therefore, the Israelites were commanded to observe the Sabbath year. And every 7 years they were to observe an extra Sabbath year. Instead of having just 1 year of abnormal or diminished economic activity, they were to have 2. And the Lord promised them, see if I don't bless you on account of this. See if I don't give you so much harvest before and after, you won't know what to do with it. So you won't even notice that for 2 years you haven't engaged in your normal ploughing and sowing and harvesting. And therefore these commands were accompanied by promises. These things were to honour God, to have compassion on the helpless, and to go with, if you like, the nature of the universe. And one of the most terrible things in the scriptures is the destruction of Jerusalem. It happened in the year 586 BC. I quote, "And they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of the Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile those who had escaped from the sword, and became servants to him and to his sons, until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of the prophet Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years." That great, terrible act of judgment on Jerusalem for their sin, for their wickedness, was somehow fulfilled in the land having its Sabbaths. 70 years of rest, 70 years of exile to make up for 490 years of wrongdoing. You might say, what's that got to do with us? It is part of our nature to need rest. Our land needs rest. We need to defend the helpless and the weak and have compassion on them by granting them rest. We can ask ourselves, have we done this? Because now we are being forced to rest. Something has happened in our culture that has forced us to take this rest. Some of us are feeling it more than others. Some of us are actually pretty busy. But as a whole, as a community, there is greatly diminished economic activity. It's almost like the Sabbath year. Now, if the Sabbaths, if those 70 years of rest came about as a judgment on Israel, I'm wondering, is there something happening that we need to acknowledge? Because we're now forced to rest. If we engage in an unhealthy lifestyle, if we work simply too hard, at some point our health will fail and we will be forced to rest. We'll be in hospital, we'll be ill in bed, we'll be prematurely aged. And therefore there's a kind of injunction, a kind of instruction. Take your rest voluntarily, or you'll have it forced upon you. What rest might we have taken before? I'm not saying that this is actually a cause and effect. I'm not saying there's a simple equation of this happened, therefore this happened, and therefore we have coronavirus. But it gave me pause for thought. I thought this is a kind of rest, a kind of Sabbath rest. And therefore we can benefit from it, because it's in our nature to need rest. We can honour God in it, because that's what the Sabbaths were for. We can have compassion on the helpless and the defenceless, because that also is what the Sabbaths did. And we can ask ourselves, are we making the best use of our time? Are we taking the rest? Are we acknowledging the way we are made? Are we honouring God in the way we live our lives? Are we having compassion on the helpless and on the weak? But added to all these things, there is a letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament. The author to the writer of the letter says, "So therefore let us strive to enter that rest." He was writing this in direct response to Psalm 95. in which God says in the end of the psalm, 40 years was I grieved with this generation that they should not enter my rest. He was speaking about the Israelites in the wilderness not arriving in the promised land, which was their rest. Their rest from the wilderness, their rest from journeying, from travelling, their rest from homelessness, the land. But as the writer to the Hebrews pointed out, if Moses had given them rest, what rest is pointed to? What is missing? Jesus has promised us rest, the final rest. It's worth noting that a common refrain in the Old Testament, in the histories of the kings and in the judges, is that the land had its rest, the nation had rest from their enemies. This concept of rest extends not just to a cessation from activity, but protection from trouble, deliverance from suffering. The people were given rest. And so when the writer to the Hebrews says, so let us strive to enter that rest, he's not just talking about ceasing activity. He's saying, let us therefore enter the Lord's presence, the place of rest, in which we are at peace, in which we are restored and refreshed, in which we are made new. He's speaking of heaven, the final rest, which we will enter for all eternity, the kingdom of heaven, the new heaven and the new earth. But in the meantime, let us strive to enter that rest which is found in the presence of the living God, that rest which we enter as we humble ourselves, as we worship him, as we honour him, as we have compassion on one another. Let us enter that rest in Jesus' name. Amen.